got some slides. So hello everyone, I'm here and I'm just going to share a PowerPoint now. Okay, great stuff. So hopefully everybody can see it. Okay, so thank you very much, and thank you for organising this, Andrew. I think it was your initiative too, and Claire for setting it all up. So today I'm going to just cover the basic principles and the methodology of SKA rating itself. So it's very much a sort of theoretical book of what SKA is, how would you use it, and a few little resources at the end. So that's going to be the what SKA is going to be split into two sections. So the first, as you can see on the slide, is going to be more about the actual system itself. What is the overall methodology? And on the second part, we're going to go into actually the higher education scheme itself. Just a few sort of high level details about it, and give you a bit of an understanding of what the actual scheme entails. So the assessment tool is actually looking at the environmental impacts of an interior fit out. So it's not broader sustainability, as in it would be in the correct term. It wouldn't be, it's not a triple bottom line, it's the environmental aspects. So it is looking to incentivize, guide and award all the activities that are going on within such a project. We have 3 live schemes at the moment and a pilot scheme. So we've got the retail scheme and the offices, and of course the higher education scheme that we'll focus on today. And pilots are for more generic projects that don't fall in any of these categories, and is either maybe in another country or it's in another sector in the UK where you cannot use one of the other schemes. Just to highlight that the higher education scheme came out of a few pilots. So it's actually a way that we can understand in the technical committee what is actually going on and who's interested to develop the next scheme. So SKA as a scheme is aimed both at category A and B fit outs. That's typically, I guess, in the offices sector, but you'll find that also in the higher education, further education area, where we're looking at maybe sort of base core areas of a building, plus of course the actual floored fit outs. And we have, of course, a mixture of SKA assessors that are accredited by the RICS, who owns the scheme, and undergo third-party auditing on behalf of the RICS by another external party. Every project is then rated and benchmarked against good practice and can get gold, silver, or bronze, or a pilot certificate. And SKA assessors have got the permission to use the badge, as you can see on the bottom here, just to denote their accredited status. So no project can actually be certified unless it goes through an accredited assessor audit and collection of all the evidence. So, and I think Andrew may touch upon that later. So the philosophy of SKA rating, and this applies to all the schemes and the higher education scheme, of course, is the fact that it's project driven. So it's actually looking at, well, what is going on in the project itself and how can we actually influence all the activities and behaviors in the project itself. So if something is beyond the project, it's not in scope. Incentivize good practice. So it's all good to say, well, okay, tell me how you've done, but many people don't know what good looks like. So through the actual information that we're sharing through SKA rating, we're trying to inform the industry of what good actually would look like in a sustainable fit out. The robust scoring system, of course, allows us to actually benchmark like for like and actually award the behavior that's going on in a clean cut way that everybody can understand how they can achieve something. And of course, easy to use and free to use. So easy to use was really, really important. So myself, I'm an interior designer, and it was the scheme was created by many of us in the industry for the industry. So it was really, really important that whatever we create and operate on a day-to-day basis is going to be something that we ourselves find relatively easy to use in the industry, and not another burden on top for very little return. So easy to use is always part of that philosophy. And then free to use, that's kind of part of the sustainability agenda in the sense of making things more accessible and sociably equitable. So you can always access the online tool for free and download the GPMs. I will make sure those are. So the main characteristics then, of course, that are based on this philosophy is the fact that we're measuring 100% of whatever is in the project scope. So we're not measuring things, and you're not being benchmarked on issues that are beyond that. in the higher education scheme, that comes into perhaps issues that are falling outside of the building or on different floors that you're refurbishing, or different teams. Lightweight and simple, that is part of the ethos, but not so simple that it loses credibility. So there's a fine line between making things easy and accessible, but still having robust evidence behind it, and also doing a thorough design process. Now, it does not rely on base build credit. It's quite important, because what we're looking at here is, well, what responsibility do all of us as team members and owners and operators of buildings have in our ability to influence? And so if something is on a base build, on a building itself, that we're not changing, or we haven't got the ability to change because of legal issues, perhaps ownership issues, then you're not being sort of penalized against that if you're not able to change it and it's not in the project scope. Another issue, the fact that it's assessor driven, is quite important, and it's both this and the previous issue are quite key differentiators against, for example, BREEAM and LEED, where you've got a scheme with SKA that is assessor driven. So the decision of compliance in most cases is done by the assessor. So the responsibility of compliance lies with the SKA rating assessor, and it does not lie with the RICS as an institution, which is the case, of course, with the other schemes. So you have a lot more project-based decisions being able to made by assessors, and you have obviously a much faster and user-friendly process there, because you've got your assessor actually able to make those. Now, if the assessor, of course, the onus falls onto the assessor to stick to a rule of law and make sure that they are not being pressurized many times by clients to make the right decision rather than the one the teams or clients may wish them to make. So it does have its advantages, but also disadvantages, because the assessors, of course, are audited by the RICS. And if they're found to obviously have not kept the rule, then there are consequences. So the actual costs involved with that, of course, you've got the assessor fees that are based on particular assessors themselves, pricing it as a service. And they will vary from location in the country to the scope of involvement. Plus, then you've got the actual certificate cost that goes to the RICS directly, and you pay at the end of your project when you certify the project, and it's £495 plus VAT. So that's sort of a very high level issues. And I guess the last thing I'll mention here, which is what we're saying, we're benchmarking against industry good practice. So good is basically above legal requirements that are standard practice, or issues and behaviors that at the moment are done without anybody forcing somebody or particularly asking for something. So that will be standard. So good is the next step up, but it's not best. So best would be innovation, or one supplier only in the industry providing a material, etc., etc. So we're kind of trying to push and constantly incentivize for the industry and teams to move on to the next stage, rather than push too hard and not go broad in the market. Now, the overall reasons of why we created, of course, SKA, and why these are needed, I guess from knowing some of the attendees that are here now, these are known reasons, of course, to try and incentivize for better buildings, better spaces, and of course, this affects the value of spaces, but also the productivity and effectiveness of these spaces. So other things such as, of course, energy and water management improvements, and operating costs hopefully are secondary. Close the door. Now, the actual scheme itself was actually driven by a few universities actually doing pilots, as I mentioned before, and informally using the tool to actually guide the projects. So we have about 30 universities that actually tested or registered projects on the online tool. Quite a few of those, of course, are certified, but mostly are using it unofficially. So it'd be good to get more official projects actually done, so we actually have the validity of those statements. And it's been going for about a couple of years now, as it was launched in May 2016. And let's just see more about the drivers behind. So one of the major drivers behind the scheme, other than previous issues, was actually the fact that as universities, you stand sort of in that sort of line between private public areas, and there's an accountability that's tied into that. So we got told basically that there was a need for something to help universities account for their practice, their behavior, in addition, of course, to achieving many of the energy bigger drivers that were seen from a legal legislative sort of requirement, and also other things such as highlighting legislation where currently was not known. So definitely with the Social Value Act, that was something that is something legally requested but was not being done. So there was lots of different prompts around that. These are the teams that were now involved. So these were the overall contributors and sponsors. So my company was a development partner of the scheme. UCL, for example, actually were one of the universities that did some of the initial pilots and came with a request with ORD, and overall developed the scheme, plus the technical committee and many different contributors from universities and specialist consultants. So every scheme is done by a very wide network of specialists and contributors, and it's a pleasure to work with everyone. Now, the scheme itself. So actually looking at the higher education scheme itself. So we have 131 good practice measures. So it's the biggest scheme of all of them because it combines both sort of office-based issues plus retail, and then you've got a few additional issues with the HE sector things. We have a whole new category introduced in higher education, which is the ecology. Can somebody open the door? Sorry, apologies for that. We just got in the office. Right. So we've got a whole new impact category, which is the ecology, and that came from the actual need to reflect a lot of the sort of responsibility that was live through issues happening outside of buildings themselves. And normally SKA rating isn't only looking at inside the building, but actually when we start looking at campuses and what was possible and actually should be picked up in a scheme, issues between buildings themselves became actually obvious. Huge apologies for this thing happening during a live session, but we're having things moving in and out of our office, quite surprisingly. Anyway, so ecology was introduced, and it's a question mark of whether that will apply for other schemes, but definitely at higher education projects, this was needed. So the other big issue was the fact that a more circular approach has been introduced. So circular economy and circular design was very, very much part of materials and waste processes. And that comes both in the actual criteria themselves, plus the actual actions that we do as a project team coming together, the different conversations, the different perhaps processes that you look at. And so that's something else that was very specific about the HE scheme. And then what else? The actual campus-wide issues were, of course, as I touched upon, the ecology issue was one of them. And then also you'll see that in the travel plans and energy sources. So those are just a few examples there. Okay, so then the scope of the scheme itself. So what does the scheme actually cover? So it covers cafe, retail and restaurants. So those are, of course, found in all sorts of sizes and places around a campus. We have obviously office for admin or any kind of office-based needs, classrooms and auditoriums. We have the labs themselves, very specialist. We have art and machine workshops. So a lot of the textiles courses, for example, will have lots of machines. We have, of course, a huge amount of maintenance circulation areas and reception and exhibition spaces. So this is an unusual one to include reception as opposed to, for example, the offices and retail schemes, because the reception areas are quite broad, perhaps, when it comes to HE buildings, because they do serve quite a public nature. And then we don't include certain areas related to veterinary spaces and hospitals, so those are more healthcare related, and then student accommodation and halls of residence. And this is purely to do with the nature of the spaces and how the use of these spaces would impact the ranking. So that we go more into detail on that another time if there's more need, but basically that's important to know the scope and when you would use the scheme. Then the actual stages themselves in an assessment. So we have two main stages, which is the design and the handover stage. So the design stage is looking at, well, what is your intent about on the project that you're working on? So what's your intent on what kind of materials you're going to use, or what kind of light fittings you're going to use, etc. And at the handover, what you're checking is, as an assessor or as a design team, you're checking to see, well, what did you do? And literally, how close did you get to what you initially targeted? All of that is being guided by what we call the good practice measures. So those are the actual sort of core of the scheme itself that include all the benchmarks and the criteria. And I'll show you in a second a kind of examples of that. And then you've also got the online tool where all of that kind of goes on. And I'll show you again a screenshot next of what that looks like. And the certificate in itself, and the project rating that you end up with, is dictated by the handover stage result only. And that's on whatever evidence you've collected. So even if somebody says, well, I did do this, but you can't prove that, you can't award an action. Now, and then finally, the occupancy stage is the stage that's done, can only be done a year later. And it's looking at basically, well, what were you given as an occupier? And then how have you actually used the space in use? So it really starts giving the ability to guide the in-use stage, where a lot of the impacts are happening, with sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out. You can't do it more than a year later, because it goes too far. Lots of the decisions are influenced by different reasons. So these are two examples of good practice measures. So you've got the title on the top. You have the criteria section, quite clear in all of them in the same place. You have scoping, when is it in the scope of your project or not? And then what is required as evidence for the assessments themselves. And here we have another two examples. So we have the campus and/or building-wide travel plan, and you've got the fume cupboard selection and operation. So these are quite HE specific measures. Then, so within sort of the good practice measures themselves, we have the general categories of sustainability, which you can see on the left-hand column there. And there's nothing too specialized about those if you're familiar with sustainability, which I hope most of you are, so I won't spend too long on this. The SKA ranking being from 1 to 109, for example, the officer scheme, and 1 to 131. Now, the ranking itself is dictating, or in a way, what relationship between two good practice measures there is. So all measures from number 1 to 131, all of them are affecting the environmental impact of a project, but there will be a greater or lesser impact between them. So the one that is number 1 will have a greater impact than the one that is number 50 or 131, but all of them, of course, still affect. And that is what we use the ranking for, is to drive, of course, the bigger changes to happen more often than the ones that have a smaller impact in itself. And these will change from scheme to scheme because spaces are used and owned differently. Now, what the actual scope of the good practice measures is, it could be a material specification, it could be a design process, it could be a piece of kit, like a light fitting or a boiler, or it could be performance of how you actually lay things out on a floor plate. So there could be a variety of ways that, of course, will impact the environmental performance. So the occupancy assessment, as I mentioned, happens at a year after handover, and is in a way it becomes live on the online tool, and then you can do it. But you can't do it after 2 years, so it sort of expires. So make sure you'll pick up that stage. This is a screenshot of what the online tool signing in page looks like, and you can freely register and use it right now. Well, not right now, hopefully after the webinar, but do get familiar with it. And even if you have an accredited assessor on your project, it's a really good practice for yourselves to also be invited on the registered project and to follow through the actual status of where you are and have access to the criteria yourselves. It is a very user-friendly online tool. We get really positive feedback about it, which is great. Hopefully, Andrew's going to really talk about it positively soon too. But please do test it out yourselves. So this is what you can end up with. So on the right-hand side, you've got a screenshot of the dashboard of one of, let's say, my projects, and you get to see what you're targeting. So if you're working with a client team or other consultants, everybody can see what is the target, which measures you're all working towards, and where you are at any given time throughout a project. And then on the left-hand side, you've got a certificate. So that's what a certificate actually looks like. And depending on, of course, what you've got, if you've got gold, or silver, or bronze, then that changes. So the actual evolution of SKA, so it's a scheme that we are updating all the time, and we're looking to constantly push, of course, good practice. And whereas before we were looking at, okay, to conserve resources, now we're looking actually not just to conserve resources, but to reuse them. So instead of just reducing the pollution of activities around the delivery of a fit out, we're looking to actually eliminate them completely. Instead of increasing occupant well-being, we wish to actually drive forwards positive action towards creating positive spaces. So we're constantly looking at how to do this, and this is definitely now going really quite clearly towards a circular economy and a circular design thinking approach. And you'll see that throughout the measures. And I'm just going to open up in the time we've got some of those measures and some of that thinking. So this is from the Great Recovery Project, just showing you the different life cycle choices you have around materials or services in a that you may adopt on the project. What's really important is that it's not just about the materials. So it's not just about where you got the carpet tiles from, but it's actually how you've bought the carpet tiles. So creating lease approaches, take back schemes and things like that is making sure that we keep the loop going instead of creating a linear buy, use, dispose kind of approach. So what this means though is that you're starting to engage with different people in your organizations. So we don't want just the PMs and the architects and the engineers and the contractors around the table. We want also the facility managers, we want the procurement managers, we want your HR people. So it's actually broadening who gets involved to make sure that the actual decisions that we're making and the purchasing approaches that we use can actually start becoming more cyclical. And that relates also to when things are done on projects. So again, I hope Andrew will talk a bit more of this at his session, which I think he will touch upon some of the issues. But there's certain actions that we want to see happening at particular times of the design and the delivery stages of a project. So here we've listed some of the measures done at design stage. So if, for example, you haven't designed out waste at the design stage, then you're going to have you can't actually achieve the measure in the handover stage because you haven't taken advantage of the thinking and the opportunities in the design to reduce that. Energy modeling, etc. All of these things have to happen at the design stage, and of course have a knock-on effect on what's possible in the handover stage, and then of course what's actually then achieved in real life at the occupancy stage. So I think take some time to actually go through this list yourselves, but this is the kind of thinking we are seeing happening now with the use of SKA rating, and is good practice. Now the ranking is something I mentioned before. So this is the overall ranking in the HE scheme. So wellbeing measures came up, much more reflecting the sort of predominance of that thinking, understanding of the value of spaces. Energy measures pretty much stayed still, and pollution measures came down. Now, some of the ranking themselves and some of the thinking that goes behind a lot of the SKA rating criteria and good practice is relating to actually the practicality, as we said earlier on. So if something needs, for example, an increased amount of funds, so budgets to do loads of audits and surveys, is going to actually be fitted a little bit lower down than actually a piece of kit that's going to have an immediate effect right from the day go. And that will have a high rank. So pound for pound, if something's going to deliver an environmental reduction and a positive impact, then that's going to have a higher ranking than something that is based on actually a decision, a discussion, and then other consequential sort of actions. So pollution, for example, having audits of how a plume is going to disperse around an area is actually then not necessarily reducing that pollution, it's just saying you've done that study. So some of that thinking, basically, just to give you some insight, is going on behind the actual creation and setting of the scheme. And that, of course, will relate and reflect always the next sort of step. So the ranking will change when we change the criteria at the next update of the scheme. So what we want to see and what we encourage universities and teams that are engaged with universities and colleges to do is obviously align the university strategies around all the estates, of course, the refurbishment and maintenance of that with SKA principles and standards. So if you've got purchasing of materials going on, whether it's for just the recarpeting of one bedroom or office space or lab, then actually that is done according to SKA criteria. And that, or if it's a whole building refurbishment, of course, look at that and make sure it's in the project brief. There are many tenders that can come through, and the only mention of a SKA requirement can be a one-liner as a separate document to all the other documents involved in a project. And of course, that really causes a lot of problems because no one knows they should be designing to the SKA criteria, and it causes a huge amount of misunderstanding and problems and basically kicks the ball further down the road. Upskilling in-house teams, getting your teams yourselves onto the training, it will be brilliant. Even if you do just the foundation or do also the HE assessor course, even if you're not going to act as assessors, it really helps you to understand what the requirements are in an assessment and what kind of thinking is going on. So it really upskills teams and gets them to understand sustainable design and the SKA rating framework. Updating the procurement process. So these are long-term conversations, definitely. And from project to project, you can refine the procurement approach. And a lot of suppliers are saying, we haven't got these systems in place now, but if clients ask us, we'll get them in. So it's kind of catch-22. So please do, as owners and or operators of buildings, ask suppliers to get more circular procurement approaches in place, but get those conversations going internally. And collaborate, of course, with all the departments to make this happen. And so the other thing is that we're really encouraged to get feedback. So we want to have industry forums, and I know there's some forums around the industry, even on travel plans, for example. But do feedback to the SKA Technical Committee because we really want to know where we can do better, if there are ideas of how to evolve the criteria. And we really encourage, of course, and are so delighted to see the knowledge exchange that goes on between the universities. It's such an example. We're trying to sort of share that through to other industries. And then just to make you aware, really, of a few resources. And so the SKA rating compliant product list is available. We really want to get this pushed to get more products clearly identified as compliant. There's a lot of manufacturers that were using the logo uninformally, so we've created the label so it creates that possibility. And we're getting a lot of inquiries coming through now, so we know a lot of designers and clients are asking suppliers to actually look at the label, so please do that. And it creates a much easier space to go and find compliant products rather than spending lots of time around the industry and getting mixed information. So yes, that's one thing. And then just making you aware of social sources. So we've got a SKA rating Twitter handle, LinkedIn group, and of course the SKA rating page itself. So that was a whistle-stop through of the basics of SKA, and that's with me. And I think over to Andrew straight away, perhaps, to actually look us in practice. How does a project look, and how does a university use it? So over to you, Andrew.
Elina, you'll need to just stop sharing your slides for a second, and then Andrew can share his.
Just a second. If I can find the button, that's technology for you, isn't it? There we are. Is that better?
Yeah. And then, fab.
Right. Hello. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
You talk up a little bit, Andrew.
Yeah. Sorry. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Thanks, Elina, for the presentation. So I'm just going to give an overview of how we've embedded SKA at Aston University, and kind of go through kind of the key areas, the benefits that we found, and also some kind of scopes that we found harder to actually embed into certain projects. So I'll just a second. Right, so just to give you an idea about Aston University, we're a university since 1966. We've got 4 main schools at the university, predominantly engineering, because there was an engineering college before 1966. And then we've our most recent school was opened last year as our medical school. We have just around 10,000 full-time equivalent students, and second place in the Times Higher Education for Teaching Excellence Framework. And just a few other green examples, including SKA. So we've got a carbon emission target to 48% hit by 2020, so that's coming up soon. We've reduced by 38%. We're ranked in the last People on Planet, so it's just about to come out, but the last one we were 5th out of 150 universities. We do have ISO 14001 and 50001, which has construction in our procedures, and SKA is written into those procedures. So we believe we're the second university to get a SKA HE Gold, and we're the second university to gain plastic-free community from surfers against sewage. So those are two of our kind of things there. So just to go about how the hierarchy of sustainable construction within Aston University, and to give you a bit of context of where SKA sits. So any new build, we used to have BREEAM Excellent between 2010 and 2015. And it was decided that that it was felt that BREEAM was a very points chasing exercise and very costly exercise for the university, where we weren't really gaining much from it. So we had a BREEAM Excellent building open up, and it is probably the worst rated deck on campus. So we decided to write our own bespoke construction spec. And in there, we have actually taken all the aspects, BREEAM and SKA in particular, that we really liked, and the things we were doing anyway, and we've put those into the spec. And then other aspects of other kind of sustainable schemes are generally in there as well. And so we've just opened our new student union, which in April this year, and it was the first building to kind of be built to have this sustainable construction spec within all the specifications and the design of the building. After that, most of our projects are refurbishment projects. We haven't really got much space to do brand new buildings everywhere. So what we decided is that anything over £1 million we would actually assess for a SKA HE, and we were going to target gold. And anything under $1 million, we would look at the methodology of kind of SKA, and the kind of the reasons behind getting gold is when we first did the assessment of BREEAM, of where we were, if we weren't really going to actually pay for the accreditation, what would we get generally, what kind of rating would we have? We felt it was very good. With our spec. And then when we looked at SKA, what would we get if we were just generally doing our spec? It was around a high silver, if not gold anyway. So we thought we might as well aim for gold, because we would be doing it no matter what, and it kind of just helps support a lot of other things that we've embedded from SKA, has actually strengthened the project team and the kind of the way it works, the steps it does to delivering the project even better. So as Elina mentioned, there's a number of areas and scopes that the SKA looks at, and so that's how we try to embed it into our projects team. So at the moment, small projects, they've got like a checklist of kind of the key materials that they'll be kind of using, and kind of which kind of contractors and suppliers that we kind of would prefer, and then also what they're trying to do is make sure that they've embedded as much as they can SKA without making their job too onerous. So we don't want having too many meetings, which that's why it had to be the projects over £1 million. We didn't want to make it extra work for the smaller projects. So just to give you an idea, so I'm just going to go through most of the key headlines of scopes of SKA. There's a couple that I've left out because they haven't affected us yet, so I can't really comment too much about them. But to start with is kind of the design stage. So what we do, and a lot of these things we were doing anyway, so SKA's just helped kind of improve, make it a bit cleaner. what we were doing. So we were already doing, you know, a design workshop where we have like an overview of the project. We were involving stakeholders from other from the departments who would be using the end product. We kind of had a passive design approach, so we were already kind of saying, well, this worked. We want to reduce our energy efficiency, energy use. We want to kind of make it more sustainable if possible, but we weren't that strict on certain things, because obviously there was a lot of things in SKA that we didn't really think about yet. We were already doing kind of furniture inventory anyway, because we don't have much space. We have to kind of think quite carefully, where does it go, what's going to happen to it. And on some cases we were doing kind of a pre-refurbishment audit and design out waste. So depending on who was the project manager, would kind of, sometimes they were saying, oh, these doors will go into storage, or that will be used for maintenance, but it wasn't everything on the SKA list. And so what we do is we add all the So what we do, we meet with our architects first and our M&E designers, and we go through the project that's going to happen, and we sit through and we actually work out what's in scope initially, and that takes a good 2 hours to kind of go through each one. And what we're trying to do at this stage is come up with, this is the best and easiest solution for the contractors who will be coming on site to do the work. And the other thing is, it helps if the M&E aren't used to it, they can ask questions at this stage, because they're already used to BREEAM, so a lot of the time it didn't make a big impact just to change kind of what they were doing. And the other thing I found is the architects are really on board. So our main architect, actually, he drives the SKA projects now. He literally has a massive spreadsheet with everything that's in scope, what they achieved last time and what they hope to achieve next time, and he follows that. So that's been really helpful. And then once we've chosen that list, as Elina mentioned, to put it into the project brief. So what we have in our project brief that goes out to tenders, our M&E and our architects will literally copy and paste each scope that we're looking to achieve. So if it's an electrical scope, it will have the main description of what we're trying to achieve in the specification. So they're basically saying, you will get this, and these are the reasons for it. And they design their kind of electrical and mechanical designs to fit that as well. And so for all the equipment wise and materials, that's already in the brief when it goes out to tender. And then what we do is, when we sit with the kind of contractors, like I said, we've already told them this is the easiest and best way to obtain it. We're after a gold, and it's up to them to go to hit gold. So you would think and hope that they follow the scopes that we've met, but what we have said is, if they don't meet those scopes and they're not hitting gold, then they still have to find it some other way. So it's and that way they'll have to pay for, because we found there's a number of scopes that we don't do because we haven't got a huge budget, and we found that they are slightly more expensive. So we've said, well, if you're not going to do the easiest and the cheaper route, then you'll have to kind of pay for one of these trickier ones. And also, if you're not going to hit gold, it is kind of, we've said to them, we're going to hold with a final payment until we've actually had all the evidence and everything through. And then and that kind of really drives them to send the evidence quite quickly. And as mentioned, so what we've really found that we've had 2 golds now, and we're working on our 3rd one, is really trying to keep everyone on track as having those updates quite regularly and telling them straight away what issues we found, so that they're aware and won't repeat those issues. So just to give you an idea of kind of the some of the scopes that we mainly work on and how we kind of embed it, so it's easily done for each project. So all our mechanical equipment, we basically say it has to be on the energy technology list, or at least meet it. We seem to use the same specifications for a lot of mechanical stuff, so we know they're going to meet the criteria. When we get another project, we know which companies are kind of already can evidence quite easily. Similar to our lighting, so we only use really Thorlux Smart LED. We know that meets the criteria, and that's our general spec, so we were doing that anyway. That's not addition to SKA, and that's quite, that helps with achieving a lot of scopes, just to have that kind of technology involved. We're on a district network, so it's quite a quick win with this one, because we don't really have boilers. We've just got heat pipes going in, and because of our refurbs is a small area within a large building, we generally just try and improve the installation when we're doing those areas. Pretty much everywhere will go on BMS anyway. I've misspelled individual there, but they have individual controls, so people can use the TRBs, but there's also lighting controls, and in some cases we have given access to people where they can adjust the BMS slightly, but it will readjust at midnight. So that's kind of our standard. We only have single glazed in our main building where we've done the main projects so far. We haven't done it for any other building, but they're all really drafty. So what we always do anyway is that we completely refurb the windows, make sure they're closed, make sure there's no draft, that we repaint them, reseal them, recork them, and so that helps meet the scopes anyway. Materials, we thought this would be the hardest set of scopes to achieve, but actually is one of the easiest set of scopes, because as we started researching the materials, we were pretty much, our standard spec materials were already hitting the criteria. It was just either getting the evidence from them, or it was just slightly choosing a different product. So for example, we used I think they're called Dexo. There might be a Deco, I can't remember actually, and so they were our carpet supplier, and they already did a take back scheme, so you just have to pallet the carpets up and they'll take them back, the old carpets. Senator are our preferred supplier for furniture, and they pretty much had environmental declaration certificates for every item of furniture that they've got going. And they've got their own kind of recycling facility. They take back all the packaging. A lot of the packaging was reusable. So that was great. Glazed partitions, which we were already using, met the criteria. Timber was quite easy, because it's almost quite difficult not to get timber with FSC accredited mix. And we were using Dulux Trade, and they made the SKA criteria. We'll mention one of the snagging was actually paint later on, and then other things, like I said, it was kind of easy to meet. It was installation. Most of the joinery we found, it was just tricky to get the evidence. We did find eventually that most joinery places we could get that we were using would meet the criteria, and things like ceiling tiles. So we actually haven't done the take back scheme yet, but because we thought it'd be too tricky, but then we found out Armstrong, who are a big ceiling tile provider, would take back the ceiling tiles as long as they were theirs for free, and they'll do that even if you're not doing a project. If you're just kind of getting rid of a load, as long as it's theirs, there's a code underneath the ceiling tile, so they have to just make sure that they're the correct ones. So that's a future project. We'll be aiming to embed that. So project delivery, things we're already doing, like I said, so soft landings, commissioning, we're already training people. We're a client partner of CCS, we're already trying to push CCS anyway, and trying to get the contractors to be either CCS registered or a partner. Building user guides, so we're already putting, as you can see, this is just a kind of A4, there might be 2 pages that goes in each main room. It educates them how to use the lights or the AB or the heating, and so we're putting those into all the rooms. We've got a larger guide that gets written up at the end, that goes to the users, and that's kind of been really helpful. and also things, social value actions. A lot of companies and contractors were kind of doing this already, so they're already employing apprentices. Local spend. One of them initially sent us photos of them using the Gregs near our university, saying that was the local spend, and we kind of try to educate them on that part. But then, so we found that most of them were using West Midlands subcontractors anyway, and sourcing materials from there. Those are quite easy to achieve. Another one that I guess could be a cheat is our canteen is already kind of fair trade status university, and we did say that because they struggle for spaces for to eat, we said that contractors can use our canteen, and then hopefully that kind of meets that kind of that item of the social value. Move on. Waste. So this is probably our hardest. We find it's the trickiest because we do struggle with space, and we do struggle to find what to do with a lot of stuff that we need to move out and get rid of before the work starts. And beforehand, we were finding that we were just getting skips and filling the skips literally a week before the work started. So it was trying to get that thought process that people had to organise this early on. So we do still struggle with door waste and large workstations, especially if they're really coming to the end of the life, because we have to do a lot of fire egg doors and things like this. So we struggle to kind of give those to charities. And the first time we did it, we struggled to get the 5 reduced packaging. So you have to try and find suppliers who provide returnable, reusable packaging. And that was one thing we had to keep asking about. No matter how many times you mention it, they kept forgetting to take photos. But the last one we just crept in. So there's some electrical drums, the wiring drums there for some supplier. There's some glass that just came on a pallet. And another supplier had these kind of plastic and reusable cardboard. And sometimes you find you do have to take kind of a pinch of salt, because sometimes they have the doors have protective packaging, but they're on pallets, and then so you have to have some kind of, well, okay, they're not in big boxes and things like that. Well-being. So one of the things we weren't really doing is, well, we're doing it for building regs, we're hitting ventilation rates, but this obviously has higher than building regs. So now we kind of meet SKA for our projects, we hit their ventilation rates. Depending on where you are in the main building, your outside view is either that one of the lovely courtyard or of the lovely campus. But pretty much everywhere, because they're very narrow corridors, is that you have to have, there will be an outside view. We always break out spaces. We were hitting that with the size of the space and what was available. Biophilic design, we were kind of doing what we could do better, probably still better now, because we were hitting ventilation rates and outside views and things like that. But we weren't really, we're not designing spaces that have that biophilic kind of with nature. We're not using moss tables and things like that. So that's something maybe we could work on. When we weren't really doing CO2 monitoring with BMS, we just started it, but now we have started putting that into the kind of any project and the SKA ones. So we will monitor that on the BMS in key locations around in the space. And we were doing daylight. We do daylight control, so that's mainly glare control. So that's the film and the blinds, but we struggle to hit the material because sometimes there's a number of scopes that hit a few things, so we didn't get the material section because it was just kind of costly exercise, and sometimes there's blinds are the last thing that people think about and they just buy them. And so, like I said, the scopes we struggled with improved daylight, because we were actually reducing spaces and putting glazed partitions, but actually so there used to be big open daylight in spaces, but so we're actually reducing the amount of daylight, but we're trying to get as much daylight as possible in the design. Energy modelling, air quality, thermal comfort, etc. we don't really do because of the cost involved. So we've never really done those. We do a passive, like I said, energy measure. We don't really do any of the refrigerants because there's also some high costs in there. So we try and push it as much as possible. So what we try and do is we aim to get at least 5 scopes above gold that we can work with. So these things kind of get dropped off quite quickly. Water and waste we struggle with because this main building only has 1 water meter for us, 7-story 1960s building, and it's pretty impossible from what I'm told to put any more water meters in because the amount of pipe network that we've got would be very complicated. And the same as waste, we only have 1 waste yard, so it's trying to work out how much water they're going to use. It's quite difficult. And then fine air filters, we only have a small space to work with, so we can't really put, so the argument is they could put fine air filters in, but then they have to make the plant larger to obtain the ventilation rates that we want. So we usually have to take those out. And VOC monitoring, so the construction team usually do it while they're doing the work, but we don't pay to put it into the BMS. I think that's me done. I think we're going to any questions.
If anyone has any questions, if you could just unmute yourself and then just ask away. If you don't have access to a microphone, there is a chat box. So if you can chat, put your questions into the chat box, we can have a look at some of those too.
Who's going to go first? Anyone?
Elina, have you got any questions for Andrew?
I do actually. So I think it was on. We've got a question here, but take that question first, and then I can ask mine after everybody else has asked theirs.
Okay.
There's a question from Michael Checkley. Andrew, how many of your team did you get trained on SKA?
So there's only 2 of us in the sustainability team. So I'm a trained assessor, but for the last project, a colleague of mine, I literally just said I want to for performance development is to become, work through the assessment of the project. So I shadowed her during those stages, and then I submitted the submission. So hopefully, maybe next year we're going to try and see if she can become an assessor. Like I said, so we only really so we're on our 3rd project, we seem to only get 1 or 2 a year that go over the million. I mean, this current one is only just underneath, but we decided to still do it. So it's not a huge onerous task. And like I said, the architects have really helped because they've done a lot of the work for us.
Right. There's one here from Gilbert Valentine. Was the Aston single glazing at finish or prior to improvement?
So our main building is, so like I said, it's I think it was 1950s built. I can't remember, but maybe it was before then. So it's the largest brick building, a working brick building in Europe. And so it's all single glazed, and we get a lot, like I said, a lot of drafty windows where they don't close properly. So yeah, so they're already there. We haven't done anything. We're still the same windows. We've just taken off the paint and then refurbished it and recorked it.
So there is a measure that actually targets windows in the scheme, because a lot of HE institutions occupy listed or older buildings. So we knew this was the nature. And so we have introduced an actual measure that shares different sort of tasks that can be undertaken towards improving the installation of those windows and the performance of those windows. It's called secondary glazing. So it does look at adding also secondary glazing wherever there's single glazing. But in cases where that's not possible either, it is doing the activities that Andrew has just explained, refurbishing them basically and making sure they actually shut. So yeah. Shall I answer to the other one by Amy? Our contractors finding.
It's for you, really, Elina.
Really? Okay.
Amy, are contractors finding it difficult to engage with SKA, particularly with smaller projects, and do you offer any training or consultations?
You don't think that's for me?
What's either of you?
Well, from our side, like I said, so the architects aren't finding it. We can't. Oh, so contractors, yes. So most of the contractors have heard of BREEAM, but yeah. So it is more of an education, and you've got to go. Like I said, you sit there for a good 2 hours working through the scopes, and they understand it. And well, eventually they understand it, and it is in their kind of, like I said, the spec and the tendering there, so they are aware of it when they sign on for the job. We have had people going when we haven't had a couple of evidence, we're waiting for it, saying, oh, do you really need it? You know, kind of thing, what is the benefit of having whatever paint was one of the issues, I think. So because we found one of the paint tins kind of didn't have Dulux, it was a different type. So they do kind of question it, but at the end of the day, we say, well, this is what you've signed up to. You've known what it is about, and really it's about, we're trying to make it as sustainable as possible. So it's not just, you know, the small little things. We are trying to change how people, the mindset of the project. So yeah, they've kind of questioned it, but not loads. But you do have to keep on top of it and keep reminding them certain things.
Okay, so from my experience, both as a technical committee and engaging with the industry parties, we get lots of different aspects of the industry coming to us with questions or engagement, basically. And also from projects that I've assessed myself. So overall, I'd say the contractors have been the first party that's engaged with the scheme and the most keen one, and the designers have been the least. So it was really encouraging to hear you, Andrew, that you've got obviously a team on board that is very much on it, and really, really encouraging. So, so overall, I would say contractors have been most, as I said, keen. Engineers have had that sort of BREEAM upskill over energy issues over the decades, and have needed, on one hand, the least hand-holding and least explaining, but on the other hand, they have not understood the difference between fit-out and whole-build thinking. And that's where a lot of the differences between architectural sustainable design and interior sustainable design happens. And actually, how we use those spaces and how we design for them is different. And so a lot of the engineers, I'd say, haven't had that. And the same thing with some of the architects as opposed to interior designers. So that thinking, the life cycle thinking, is really, really important to happen. And I'd say you see that difference in the industry. And then between smaller and larger projects, again, you see how many consultants you can have on board for the relevant budgets, and that you can engage with on a project. Now, do we offer any training for contractors? Everybody can actually do the training that's available. I do the training, in fact, for all the assessors. So Andrew participated in one of our first sessions, and we're currently doing actually a training course, and people can actually probably still join, or maybe have to register for a future course. But it's open. The foundation course itself is open to any contractor, designer, or anyone, just to find out how the scheme works. And then, as I said earlier on, you could do the HE training, even if you're not going to be an assessor, just to get the thinking, as Andrew has explained, really. And as I think, Andrew, even if you weren't an assessor, probably that thinking helped you understand the whole way the assessment's done and how to take action, if that's fair to say.
Yeah.
Elina, just a quick one. How often do you run that training?
It's done, initially we had it fixed, but then we saw that actually people weren't necessarily fitting to those dates. So the foundation can be done at any time online. It's not a live session, it's a fixed sort of module. The HE training, though, has to be, we do it as soon as we have enough participants. So we have a register yourself email address, I think, or to the online training team of the RICS. And then as soon they collect all the names and inform them when the date is coming. So the sooner we've got the number that they think is enough, then we run a training course.
I think we've just got time for one more. Andrew from Rebecca Bennett, on average, what are the additional project costs for the assessment?
Yeah, so apart from the certification cost and the training cost to become an assessor, which is quite minimal, there's no real, so the projects we've done, we haven't really increased the cost compared to what we would have done anyway, because as I mentioned, a lot of our stuff is already in our general spec, and so as I mentioned, we would hit a SKA silver, if not high gold. And I think when I was first doing the training, or it might have been a presentation beforehand, I think to get at least silver, you shouldn't really be adding any cost to the project. It's more of changing the mindset and the behaviour of people and choosing different materials rather than the other. So like I said, the materials we chose didn't really cost anything different. We just had to specify certain ones. And so I mean, I guess the smart LED we do with Thorlux was in our general spec, which maybe a lot of universities or places don't have that yet. But we've been doing that for the 2 years previous to that, I think, from memory. So that is a higher cost than, I guess, non-LED. But we were used to those costs. And a lot of the other things, like I said, is just during the meetings, when you're having the meeting, kind of maybe there's a bit more paperwork involved and admin, but there's no additional major costs.
So from Andrew, that was great. So if you say, can I add to that on some of the earlier projects, especially in retail, where some clients actually tested to see the difference between a silver and a gold. And again, it does depend from client to client and design scheme from design scheme. But if a project, one particular retailer, I think it was Lush, who wanted to actually push their certificate from a silver to a gold, they actually did it very intentionally and actually measured a 30% increase for them at that time between a silver and a gold. And as soon as then they applied the volume to all their stores, it became exactly the same price. So between a silver and a gold. So actually sometimes it's not the same because volumes are included and stuff like that. But that's, of course, retail has that advantage. But many times the difference, as Andrew said, is not necessarily on costs or anything like that. It could be an audit or something like that. But sometimes it's just choosing the right product instead of actually one that's not right. So I wouldn't say it's always down to cost. I'd say the biggest impact is on just having enough capacity as a team to put the time in, to do the thinking, to have those conversations, to monitor that things are going through. So I'd say many times it's more about just that capacity in teams rather than actually a budgetary issue. So.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt you there, Elina. We are out of time. Just so you are all aware, we are going to get the presentation onto the Sustainability Exchange in the next few days. We will send a link out to everyone to show you where that is. We will also be sending out a very quick feedback survey. It would be really appreciated if you could just take 2 minutes to just fill that out so that we can continue to support the sector in everything. And hopefully we will see a lot of you in a couple of weeks' time at the conference. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you all soon.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks, Elina. And
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.